At 71, John Travolta has reached a stage of life and career where revelation no longer means confession, and honesty no longer needs to be dramatic. The phrase often attached to recent discussions about him at 71, John Travolta finally reveals what we all suspected, suggests a hidden truth, but the reality is more nuanced. What Travolta has effectively revealed is not a scandal or a long-kept secret, but a quiet confirmation of something the public has sensed for years. He has fundamentally redefined what matters to him. For decades, Travolta existed at the volatile intersection of fame, talent, and public expectation. From the explosive success of Saturday Night Fever and Grease to his career revival in Pulp Fiction, he experienced both extremes of Hollywood adoration and indifference. Many actors spend their later years trying to recapture former relevance. Travolta, by contrast, appears to have stepped away from that pursuit altogether. This shift did not happen abruptly. It unfolded gradually, shaped by personal loss, professional experience, and team. In recent years, Travolta's public statements and behavior indicate a deliberate retreat from the constant performance that celebrity demands. He has spoken openly about grief, resilience, and the importance of presence, particularly in relation to his family. Rather than framing these experiences as obstacles, he presents them as formative forces, events that clarified his priorities and stripped away illusions about what success truly provides. The public long suspected that fame had lost its hold on him. His recent demeanor effectively confirms it. Equally revealing is his relationship with work. Travolta continues to act, but selectively and without the urgency that once defined his career. He no longer positions each role as a comeback or a statement. Instead, projects appear to be chosen for personal interest, creative curiosity, or simple enjoyment. This approach suggests an actor who no longer measures value through box office performance or critical validation. What audiences suspected, that he was no longer chasing approval, now feels evident. Another element reinforcing this perception is Travolta's visible comfort with solitude and private passions, particularly aviation. His long-standing identity as a licensed pilot is not a hobby for publicity, it is a parallel life. Flying offers structure, precision, and calm qualities that contrast sharply with the emotional unpredictability of Hollywood. By investing deeply in something entirely separate from acting, Travolta demonstrates a broader sense of self, one not dependent on applause. At 71, the most significant revelation is Travolta's self-possession. He appears unburdened by the need to explain himself or correct public narratives. In doing so, he confirms what many already believed, that he has made peace with both his fame and his ordinariness. This acceptance, rather than any dramatic disclosure, is the truth quietly coming into focus. If Part 1 established that John Travolta has redefined his priorities, Part 2 reveals how fully he has let go of the narrative once imposed on him. For much of his career, Travolta was not merely an actor, but a symbol of disco-era youth, Hollywood resurgence, and later, public scrutiny. At 71, what becomes increasingly clear is that he no longer feels obligated to participate in the story others continue to tell about him. Hollywood has a long tradition of framing aging actors within narrow categories: the fallen star, the triumphant survivor, or the nostalgic icon. Travolta has quietly declined all three roles. He does not present himself as a man reclaiming glory, nor as someone wounded by past neglect. Instead, he occupies a less marketable but far more stable position, that of an individual who understands the transient nature of public approval and has stopped negotiating with it. This shift is evident in how Travolta engages with the media. His interviews are measured, reflective, and notably free of defensiveness. When faced with speculation about his career choices or personal life, he does not attempt to control the narrative through clarification or rebuttal. Silence, in this context, functions as autonomy. By choosing when not to speak, he signals that he no longer equates visibility with relevance. The same philosophy applies to his professional output. Travolta's recent roles, while less prominent than his earlier work, suggest an actor unconcerned with legacy building in the traditional sense. He is not curating a final chapter designed to impress critics or audiences. Instead, he appears to be working within his own parameters, accepting roles that align with his current interests, schedule, and emotional bandwidth. This restraint, often misunderstood as withdrawal, is more accurately a form of control. What the public may have long suspected is that Travolta's relationship with fame was never entirely comfortable. Unlike performers who thrive on constant exposure, he always maintained interests and identities outside acting. With age, those parallel identities have moved from the margins to the center of his life. Aviation, family, and privacy now outweigh the symbolic power of stardom. The suspicion that Hollywood was no longer his primary home is no longer speculation. It is observable fact. There is also a broader cultural implication to this evolution. In an industry obsessed with reinvention, Travolta's path suggests an alternative: disengagement without bitterness. He does not reject his past, nor does he attempt to rewrite it. He simply treats it as one phase among many. This posture challenges the assumption that public figures must remain accessible, explainable, and perpetually productive to retain dignity. Ultimately, what John Travolta reveals at 71 is not a hidden truth, but a resolved one. He demonstrates that fulfillment does not require closure in the public eye. By stepping back without drama, he affirms something quietly radical in celebrity culture: that a life can be complete even when the spotlight fades. And in confirming this, he validates what many had already sensed, that he was ready to live beyond the narrative, on his own terms. As John Travolta enters his 70s, the question of legacy inevitably follows. For most public figures of his stature, legacy becomes a managed project, carefully curated roles, selective interviews, and symbolic appearances designed to secure a favorable final eye impression. What makes Travolta's current phase distinctive is his apparent refusal to treat legacy as something that must be engineered. Instead, he allows it to emerge organically, shaped by consistency rather than performance. Throughout his career, Travolta's legacy has already been rewritten multiple times. He has been the breakout star, the cautionary tale, the triumphant comeback, and the enduring cultural reference point. Few actors have experienced such dramatic fluctuations in public perception. At 71, he seems acutely aware that any attempt to control how history remembers him would be both futile and exhausting. The suspicion that he no longer cares how he is categorized now feels well-founded. This mindset is reflected in how Travolta relates to his past work. He neither distances himself from it nor romanticizes it excessively. Films like Saturday Night Fever, Grease, and Pulp Fiction are acknowledged as important chapters, not defining endpoints. By refusing to anchor his identity to any single era, he resists the nostalgia trap that often confines veteran actors. His past remains accessible, but it does not dictate his present. Another element shaping this redefined legacy is mentorship through example rather than instruction. Travolta does not position himself publicly as a guide for younger actors, yet his trajectory offers a powerful, if implicit, lesson. Longevity in life does not require constant visibility. In an age where relevance is measured by frequency of appearance, his restraint stands out as a countercultural choice. The public may have suspected that he had outgrown the need for validation. His behavior now confirms it. There is also a deeper emotional dimension to this phase of his life. Having endured profound personal loss, Travolta approaches Time with a heightened sense of realism. His choices suggest an understanding that energy is finite and should be invested deliberately. This perspective reshapes the meaning of success. Rather than accumulating achievements, success becomes the ability to live without fragmentation, to integrate work, passion, and personal values into a coherent whole. What ultimately distinguishes Travolta at 71 is not reinvention, but resolution. He appears settled in a way that cannot be manufactured through publicity or accolades. This resolution is visible in his calm public presence, his selective engagement with projects, and his willingness to exist outside the dominant rhythms of Hollywood. The long-standing suspicion that he had already moved on internally from the industry's expectations now seems indisputable. In the end, John Travolta's evolving legacy is less about what he adds and more about what he chooses to leave behind. By stepping away from the pressure to define himself for others, he allows his life and work to speak in retrospect. And in doing so, he confirms a truth many sensed all along, that fulfillment, at its highest level, is quiet, self-directed, and free from the need for explanation. In the final analysis of John Travolta's life, at 71, what emerges most strongly is not withdrawal, decline, or nostalgia, but authority. The authority that comes from choice. This is perhaps the clearest confirmation of what audiences have long suspected, that Travolta's greatest achievement may not be any single role, but his ability to decide when effort, exposure, and ambition are no longer necessary. Authority, in this sense, is not loud or performative. It does not announce itself through awards, campaigns, or carefully staged comebacks. Instead, it is visible in absence. Travolta's selective presence in public life reflects a man who understands that participation is optional. Where earlier stages of his career were shaped by opportunity and momentum, this stage is defined by discretion. He engages when it aligns with his values, and disengages without apology when it does not. This discretion is especially striking in an era dominated by constant self-disclosure. Celebrities are increasingly expected to narrate their lives in real time, offering explanations, reactions, and personal context on demand. Travolta resists this expectation. He does not monetize his private experiences, nor does he convert personal hardship into branding. The suspicion that he valued privacy more than validation is no longer hypothetical. It is observable in his consistent refusal to overshare. His choices also reflect a refined understanding of Time. At 71, Time is no longer something to be filled indiscriminately. It is curated. Projects are weighed not only against professional merit, but against personal cost. This recalibration challenges a deeply ingrained Hollywood assumption that productivity equals worth. Travolta's current rhythm suggests the opposite, that restraint can be a measure of clarity rather than decline. Importantly, this authority does not manifest as rejection of the industry that made him famous. Travolta has not turned cynical or dismissive toward Hollywood. He simply relates to it differently. Acting is no longer a source of identity, but one of several avenues through which he may choose to express himself. This detachment allows him to participate without dependency, preserving dignity on his own terms. What many had suspected, that Travolta was no longer driven by external approval, finds its strongest evidence here. He appears uninterested in correcting misconceptions, chasing relevance, or defending his choices. This indifference is not apathy. It is confidence without exhibition. It signals a man who trusts his internal compass more than public consensus. As this phase of his life unfolds, John Travolta offers an understated but powerful model of aging in public. He demonstrates that maturity does not require reinvention or explanation. It requires alignment. By choosing where to invest his attention and where to withhold it, he exercises a form of quiet authority, rarely celebrated but deeply resonant. In confirming what audiences long suspected, Travolta does not deliver a dramatic revelation. Instead, he offers something more enduring, proof that a life shaped by conscious choice rather than constant reaction can stand firmly even as the spotlight moves on. By the time John Travolta reaches 71, there is a sense that his life is no longer open for debate. For decades, critics, fans, and media outlets have interpreted his choices, his silences, and his career turns as though they were puzzles to be solved. What becomes evident in this final phase is that Travolta has quietly removed himself from that interpretive cycle. The suspicion that he no longer feels accountable to public judgment now appears fully confirmed. Earlier in his career, every decision Travolta made was framed as symbolic, each role a statement, each absence a setback, each return a comeback. That framing required him to exist in relation to external expectations. At 71, that relationship appears dissolved. His actions no longer invite explanation, and his lack of commentary deprives speculation of fuel. In effect, he has reclaimed authorship over his own narrative by declining to participate in its public construction. This withdrawal from interpretation does not signal disengagement from life or work. Rather, it reflects a shift in authority. Meaning is no longer negotiated with the audience. Travolta acts, speaks, and appears according to his own internal logic. If his choices confuse or disappoint observers, he makes no effort to resolve that discomfort. The long-standing suspicion that he had outgrown the need to be understood now feels undeniable. There is also a philosophical maturity underlying this posture. Travolta appears to recognize that public understanding is inherently unstable. Reputation shifts with cultural mood, generational change, and selective memory. Attempting to secure a fixed interpretation is therefore an endless and ultimately futile task. By opting out, he conserves energy for pursuits that offer permanence, family, discipline, and personal fulfillment. In this sense, his life at 71 functions as a counterpoint to celebrity culture's obsession with transparency. Where others offer access, Travolta offers boundaries. Where others explain, he demonstrates. This approach reframes privacy not as secrecy, but as self-respect. The public may no longer feel entitled to clarity, but it gains something subtler, an example of composure unshaken by scrutiny. What many had suspected over the years, that Travolta was more inwardly resolved than publicly expressive, reaches its clearest expression here. He no longer needs to persuade anyone of his contentment. His stability is implicit in the consistency of his behavior. There are no dramatic pivots, no attempts to rebrand, no public reckonings staged for approval. In closing this arc, John Travolta's most decisive revelation is his refusal to be explained. At 71, He stands as someone who has lived long enough in the public eye to recognize its limits, and wise enough to step beyond them. The story does not end with a final statement or grand gesture. It ends with something far rarer, a life complete enough to require no interpretation at all. At 71, John Travolta embodies a condition that public life rarely allows: completion without closure. Audiences are accustomed to endings, farewell tours, final performances, retrospective interviews that neatly summarize a life's meaning. Travolta offers none of these. Instead, he exists in an open-ended state that feels settled rather than unfinished. This, perhaps more than anything else, confirms what many had long suspected. He is not waiting for a final chapter to validate what has already been lived. In celebrity culture, aging is often framed as a problem to be solved. Actors are encouraged to transition, reinvent, or pass the torch, as though remaining still were a failure of imagination. Travolta's current posture challenges that logic. He has not announced an exit, nor has he staged a reinvention. He simply continues, selectively and quietly, without framing his actions as part of a larger narrative. The absence of closure becomes a statement in itself. This approach reflects a deep comfort with ambiguity. Travolta appears unconcerned with whether his career is perceived as ongoing or complete. That distinction matters far more to observers than it does to him. By refusing to define an endpoint, he sidesteps the pressure to summarize or justify. Life, in his case, is not being prepared for review. It is being lived according to present alignment rather than retrospective coherence. What the public may have suspected, that Travolta's sense of fulfillment is internal rather than performative, is reinforced by this refusal to wrap things up. His legacy is not presented as a finished product, but as an accumulation of choices made over time. Some were celebrated, others criticized, but none appear to demand reconciliation. This lack of urgency suggests a man who has already made peace with contradiction. There is also a quiet generosity in this stance. By not insisting on a definitive interpretation of his life, Travolta leaves space for others to engage with his work on their own terms. Viewers may revisit his films through nostalgia, critique, or rediscovery, but he does not attempt to guide that process. The work stands apart from the man, freed from explanatory frameworks. At 71, Travolta demonstrates that fulfillment does not require punctuation. Completion, as he models it, is not marked by ceremony but by steadiness. His life does not feel unfinished because it is not waiting to be resolved. It feels whole precisely because it remains open. The suspicion that he had reached this internal state years ago now seems well-founded. In the end, John Travolta's most enduring contribution may not be a final performance or defining statement, but a lived example. He shows that a public life can arrive at completion without announcement, without closure, and without retreat. In doing so, he offers a rare and quietly powerful alternative to the culture of endings, one in which presence, rather than conclusion, is enough. By the time John Travolta reaches 71, what becomes most visible is not a new phase of ambition, but the freedom that follows acceptance. This freedom is subtle, often misunderstood, and rarely dramatized. Yet it is the clearest confirmation of what observers have long suspected, that Travolta has accepted his life in full, without the need to revise, defend, or redeem it. Acceptance, in this context, does not imply resignation. Rather, it reflects an integration of experience, success, and failure, visibility and obscurity, joy and loss, into a coherent internal narrative. Travolta no longer appears to rank these experiences or assign them comparative value. Each is treated as a legitimate part of a life lived publicly and privately. This integration liberates Chaim from the psychological labor of comparison, a burden that defines much of celebrity culture. The freedom that follows is evident in how he occupies space. When he appears in public, he does so without performance anxiety. There is no visible effort to project relevance, youth, or authority. He does not signal urgency, nor does he lean into nostalgia. His presence is calm, almost neutral, as if he is no longer negotiating how he is seen. This neutrality is not emptiness. It is the absence of tension between self and image. For many years, the public suspected that Travolta's relationship with fame was complex. At times, uneasy. At 71, that complexity has resolved into clarity. Fame is no longer something to be mastered or escaped. It is simply a condition that exists at the margins of his life. By neither embracing nor resisting it, he renders it largely powerless. This acceptance also reframes how he engages with opportunity. Projects are not evaluated as vehicles for redemption or legacy enhancement. Instead, they appear to be assessed through a personal lens, interest, timing, and meaning. Such criteria are invisible to the market, but deeply rational to the individual. The suspicion that he had stopped measuring success by external standards now appears conclusively confirmed. There is a broader implication in this posture, particularly for those who have lived long enough to accumulate contradictions. Travolta's example suggests that coherence does not come from correction, but from allowance. One does not need to resolve every tension or explain every choice for a life to feel complete. Acceptance, rather than justification, becomes the organizing principle. In this sense, John Travolta at 71 represents a form of freedom rarely acknowledged, freedom from the need to arrive somewhere else. He is not in transition, not preparing, not becoming. He is simply present. And in that presence, the long-held suspicion finds its final affirmation, that he has reached a point where his life no longer requires permission, momentum, or validation to feel fully his own.